Welcome, dear listener, to a different kind of history, one not told through battles or kings, but whispered through daily rituals forgotten by time. Tonight, we leave behind the noise of modern life and slip quietly into the worn sandals. A medieval villager, where the scent of hay, the chill of stone walls, and the rhythm of silence shaped even the most personal moments. Tonight, we explore the humble truth of how people relieved themselves in the Middle Ages, not with spectacle, but with slow, intimate detail. No drama, no urgency, only the soft unraveling of old habits and the quiet dignity of ordinary life. You may find yourself surprised, perhaps even gently amused, but mostly, I hope, soothed by the gentle pace of the past. If this kind of calm storytelling helps you rest, if you enjoy these slower corners of history, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more, and leave a comment sharing which part of tonight's journey you found most curious. Now take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and join me in this slow descent into forgotten customs and flickering candlelight, where even a chamber pot has a story to tell. Morning in the Middle Ages did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like mist curling through a field before the sun dares to rise. The world awoke not to the shrill beeping of alarms, but to the low, echoing toll of a bell carried on cold morning air. Somewhere, in a village tucked between a river bend and the edge of a whispering forest, time itself stirred gently from sleep. The homes were small, built from rough stone and patched with timber, their thatched roofs damp with dew. Wooden shutters kept out the night's chill, and inside, families lay huddled on straw-filled mattresses, wrapped in thick woolen cloth. Fireplaces had long gone cold, leaving the faint smell of ash and damp earth lingering in the air. It was not yet light enough to begin the day, but the silence was thinning. In this world, time was not measured by machines, but by sounds and shadows. A rooster's distant crow, the creak of leather boots on packed earth, the soft rustle of someone stirring the coals in the hearth. There were no clocks, but everyone knew when to rise. The day began when the village did, not a moment sooner, not a moment later. Outside, the narrow paths between homes were made of hardened mud and straw. Chickens scratched at the dirt, and smoke began to curl from chimneys as fires were relit. Children, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, fetched water from the well, their wooden buckets sloshing gently as they walked. Mothers prepared simple meals: dark bread, thick porridge, a slice of salted cheese if the larder allowed. Fathers and sons checked on the animals, mucked out the stalls, sharpened tools dulled by yesterday's labor. But for all its simplicity, life in a medieval village was never just about work and prayer. Beneath the rhythm of farming and feasting, of marriages and mourning, there were other, quieter rituals, daily acts so common they were rarely spoken of. And yet, they shaped every single day, for every single person. Nature calls, then, as now. But the answer, in the Middle Ages, looked very different. The act of relieving oneself, so basic, so universal, was shaped by place, class, gender, season, and superstition. While chroniclers wrote of kings and wars, these humble, human routines continued in the shadows of stone walls and silent courtyards. Tonight, we will not follow a knight into battle or a queen into her throne room. Instead, we will follow a farmer to his garden at dawn. We will sit beside a tired mother with a clay pot beside her bed. We will step quietly into the garderobes of castle towers and into the makeshift corners of peasant huts. This chapter is about the parts of history few ever speak of, but which everyone once lived through, silently, routinely, without applause. It is a walk through the oldest of human rituals, wrapped in straw and steam, echoing softly behind stone walls. So let us begin not with grandeur, but with simplicity, in a world where even privacy had to be earned, and where the smallest tasks told the truest stories of everyday life. In the Middle Ages, there was no such word as toilet. The modern term, neat and neutral, did not exist, and neither did the porcelain, the plumbing, or the privacy it implies. Instead, people used simpler, earthier phrases. It was the hidden place, or the inside, or more often, just the pit. And that, truly, is what it was. Relieving oneself was not something to be ashamed of, but neither was it spoken of openly. It simply was. A daily act so ordinary that it passed like a shadow on the wall. There were no signs, no labels, no locked doors. Only the need, the instinct, and the space. For the common folk, peasants and laborers in villages surrounded by fields and livestock, the solution was usually just a hole in the earth, often dug at the edge of a garden or behind a shed. The pit was lined with stones or planks if they could afford it, and surrounded by reeds, branches, or a simple cloth screen for modesty. In the cold seasons, snow was packed along its edges for insulation. In the summer, flies gathered quickly. But it worked, crude, functional, enough. These pits were shared by households, sometimes by neighbors, and always by time. They were covered and redone as needed. There were no flushes, only gravity. No air fresheners, only the wind. No ceramic seats, just cold stone or nothing at all. But if you climbed higher in the social ladder, the experience changed. In the manor houses of the wealthy or in the high towers of castles, there were private spaces, often called garderobes. These were narrow stone alcoves built into the outer wall of a fortress or estate. A wooden seat with a round opening was positioned over a vertical shaft. Waste would fall directly outside, sometimes onto rocks, into a moat, or just down the wall. It was practical, but far from pleasant. The smell, rising in warm weather, could fill a room. Servants were sometimes tasked with tossing herbs or ash to mask the odor. It helped, barely dot in monasteries. The solutions were more structured. Rows of stone seats sat above running water channeled from nearby rivers, part of a monastic effort toward cleanliness and order. Silence was kept even here. The monks would sit in rows, robes draped, heads bowed, the act itself becoming part of their daily discipline. Yet, between all these places, the rural pit, the castle chute, the monastic row, there was one shared truth. No one spoke of it directly. It was simply part of life, not to be named, only done. Children learned by imitation. Travelers adapted as they could. Women had their own practices, often more discreet and more burdensome. In some places, a clay pot would be kept under the bed, emptied at dawn. In others, a quick walk behind a tree or wall, with a scarf pulled over the face, was all that modesty allowed. The word toilet would come centuries later, softened by time, shaped by technology. But in the Middle Ages, there was no such comfort. Only the raw physical reality of being human in a world made of stone, straw, and silence. And so when we imagine the medieval world, it is easy to picture knights in cathedrals. But behind every great hall, there was a smaller space, tucked away, unmarked and unlit. A place that told no stories but knew them all. This was where kings and beggars alike met in the most honest way. No rank, no title, no sword could change it. In the end, even in the Middle Ages, everyone had to find their way to the pit. We often picture castles as grand and imposing, with tall towers, echoing halls, flickering torches, and richly woven tapestries. But tucked behind the velvet curtains and beneath the cold stone staircases, there were quieter, less glamorous realities. Among them was the garderobe, a word that sounds almost elegant to the modern ear, perhaps something like a wardrobe or an antechamber. But in the castles of medieval Europe, it referred to something far less dignified, a toilet. Garderobes were built into the outer walls of the castle, often high above the ground. They were narrow alcoves, barely wide enough for one person to step inside, with a simple wooden seat or just a stone ledge, carved over an open vertical shaft. Whatever was released fell directly through this shaft to the outside, collecting. In a pit, on rocks, or into the waters of a moat below. There were no moving parts, no privacy locks, and certainly no warmth. In winter, sitting on the icy stone required a certain bravery. In summer, with the wind blowing the wrong way, the stench could rise right back up the wall and into the hallways, slipping beneath door frames and drifting through the very rooms where nobles dined and conversed. And yet, for the standards of the day, this was considered luxurious. The poor had pits in the mud. The rich had pits in the sky. The difference was mostly one of elevation, not elegance. It wasn't uncommon for garderobes to serve other purposes too. Some were used to store robes or clothing, since it was believed that the strong, unpleasant smell helped repel moths and insects. In a strange way, the stink was considered useful. Servants were tasked with maintaining the area below, though this was hardly a formal or frequent duty. Occasionally, ash or straw was thrown in to absorb some of the mess, but more often, nature and time did the work. In castles with multiple floors, several garderobes might be stacked above one another in a vertical line, forming a kind of waste tower. Gravity was the only system in place, and when the shaft clogged, as it sometimes did, the results were neither royal nor romantic. Despite the grandeur of tapestries and stained glass, these spaces were dark, cramped, and cold. No one lingered inside. There was no conversation, no reflection, only a brief, practical escape into a damp corner of stone. And yet, like every part of castle life, the garderobe followed a rhythm. Just as meals were scheduled and prayers repeated, the act of stepping into that small space and doing what nature required was part of the daily order. It belonged to the same world as banquets and battles. It was the unseen, unspoken machinery that kept the household functioning. The next time you admire a medieval castle, pause for a moment and consider its walls, not just for the arches and flags, but for the silent vertical shafts built into the stone, where comfort was cold and fleeting, and where even kings sat alone, briefly and vulnerably human. Far from the stone towers of castles and the careful architecture of monasteries, life in the countryside unfolded in simpler, humbler patterns. Peasants, the backbone of medieval society, lived close to the earth in every way imaginable. Their homes were made of wood and mud, their meals grown by hand, and their daily habits dictated by the weather, the land, and necessity. Among these routines, one stood apart for its consistency: the use of the latrine pit. Behind nearly every cottage, just past the chickens and the drying herbs, there was a narrow footpath that led to the edge of a garden or field. There, away from the eyes of neighbors and the reach of the hearth fire, a shallow hole was dug, no more than a few feet deep. This was the family's private pit. Its edges were often lined with stones or old planks to prevent collapse. Around it, reeds, branches, or woven straw mats might be arranged for a small measure of privacy. A piece of worn cloth or an old wooden screen could offer modesty, but nothing more. There were no doors, no roofs, and certainly no comfort. During the day, family members would use the pit as needed, each person making the short walk through grass and mud to relieve themselves in silence. It was a natural part of the day, unspoken but expected, simple and instinctive. But when night fell and the temperature dropped, the walk to the garden became less appealing. The path grew slippery with frost. The shadows between homes thickened. And so, inside each cottage, a different solution emerged: the night pot. Often made of clay or wood, the night pot or chamber pot was placed discreetly under beds or beside sleeping mats. It was not elegant, but it was essential. In the dark hours before dawn, it spared the barefoot journey into the cold. By morning, the pot would be full, and someone, usually the woman of the house, would carry it carefully to the edge of the field, where its contents would be poured into the soil. In this way, waste returned to the land, completing a cycle as old as farming itself. The smell was ever present. Flies hovered in summer. In winter, steam rose from the pit like a strange morning offering, but no one complained. It was simply part of life. Just as meals were eaten, animals fed, and prayers whispered, the latrine was visited. There were no cleaning rituals, no scented oils, no flushes. A stick might be used to stir the soil. Ash might be scattered to dull the odor. But mostly, nature handled the rest. Over time, the pit would be covered and a new one dug nearby. The old earth left to settle down for children. It was a place of mystery and discomfort. For adults, it was routine. And for the elderly, it was a daily challenge, another task made. Harder by age. Yet in this act, so mundane and so humble, there was also a strange dignity. It was an act shared by everyone, regardless of status or story. It did not require reading or wealth or faith. It required only a need and a place. And so, in the quiet rhythm of peasant life, the daily pit was as familiar as the morning sky or the creak of the cottage door. Hidden behind straw fences and old trees, it stood, simple, waiting, and strangely eternal. It is not often remembered in stories, but it was there, every day, behind every home. And it tells us something true, that history is not only shaped by great men and great battles, but by the quiet footsteps that led, each morning, to a hole in the ground. As the stars settled over medieval rooftops and the wind grew colder through the shutters, life in villages and cities alike began to dim. The fires burned low. Conversations faded to whispers. Doors creaked shut and candles blinked out one by one. But even in sleep, the body followed its own rhythm. For those without the means or desire to step out into the dark, where mud, cold, and shadow waited, a solution sat close to hand: the night pot. These pots were simple and silent. Companions. Crafted from coarse clay, polished stone, or even wood, they rested quietly beneath beds, beside straw mats, or tucked into corners beneath hanging cloths. They bore no decoration, no name, only a purpose. When nature called in the middle of the night, there were no long walks to the garden pit or the castle garderobe. There was only the shifting of a blanket, the lifting of a pot's lid, and a moment of awkward necessity, done quietly, and returned just as quickly to its place. In the morning, this humble vessel became part of the day's first tasks. Women, often before preparing food or waking children, would carry the pot outside, carefully, steadily, trying not to spill. Some emptied them near the edge of a garden, where the waste could sink into the soil. Others walked further, to designated dumping grounds or composting pits. But in larger towns and cities, where stone streets wound tightly between buildings, there was little space for privacy or planning. So instead, the contents of night pots were simply tossed out the window, not blindly. Of course, not always. Before emptying the pot, the person would lean out and shout a warning, a phrase passed down through generations. Gardes lo. Literally, watch out for the water. This cry, spoken in haste and half-laughter, was both a courtesy and a survival tactic. It was a way of saying, move quickly if you value your shoes. Over time, the phrase echoed through alleys and courtyards until its syllables wore down into something shorter, simpler, and strangely familiar: loo. A word still used today in parts of the English-speaking world to mean toilet, carrying with it the ghost of 1,000 emptied pots. But in the mornings, before the cobblestones were fully warmed by the sun, these streets could become rivers of scent. Mixed with the smoke of early fires and the smell of horses, the sharp, sour tang of human waste clung to corners and gutters. It was for many the true beginning of the day, not the rising sun, but the rising stench. In some neighborhoods, the air was thick by sunrise. In others, local laws began to appear, forbidding the tossing of waste before certain hours. But enforcement was rare. After all, needs were needs, and the pot would not wait. These routines, unspoken and uncelebrated, were repeated every single day, generation after generation. The same motion, the same call, the same quiet relief. It may seem crude to us now. A pot beneath the bed, a splash on the cobblestones, a shouted warning in the dark, but to them, it was simply life. A habit shaped by space and time, by necessity and nightfall. And so, the night pot sits silently in the corner of history, a small sturdy reminder that even in the grandest cities of the past, comfort was carried by hand, poured by dawn, and rinsed away with the morning light. In the modern world, the act of cleaning oneself after using the toilet is so routine, so standardized, that we rarely think of it at all. Paper, plumbing, perfumed soaps, everything is prepackaged, invisible, easy. But in the Middle Ages, nothing was standardized. And cleaning oneself was never simple. Once the need was answered in a pit, a pot, or a shaft, there came the matter of cleanliness. And here, the story splits. For those with wealth, status, or access to trade, there were options. Pieces of soft linen, carefully cut into reusable strips, might be kept in baskets near the garderobe or chamber. Sometimes lemon peels were used, not for hygiene, but for scent and the soothing acidity. In especially refined circles, small squares of fabric were gently perfumed with herbs like lavender or rose, folded neatly and replaced by servants after each use. But these comforts were not common. For the vast majority of the population, peasants, workers, and travelers, cleaning oneself was a task of necessity, not comfort. There was no linen. There was no perfume. There was only what could be found. Dry hay was perhaps the most accessible. A handful of stalks, soft and crumbling, could be gathered from the barn or field, but hay was rough and often brittle. It scratched more than it wiped. Leaves were another choice, particularly broad ones when available. Dock leaves, large and smooth, were favored in some regions. But in winter, when greenery vanished, people turned to more desperate measures. Clumps of moss might be used. Wool scraps, if any, were spare. Cloth rags too worn for mending were repurposed for the most humble of duties. And then there were times when none of this was at hand. In those moments, people used the earth itself, a handful of dry soil, pressed and swept. A smooth stone, rubbed and discarded. In cold regions, even snow, clean, soft, but biting, became a temporary solution. These methods were raw and often painful. There was no softness, no sanitation, only friction. Only ritual. In coastal areas, seashells were sometimes employed, curved shapes offering a kind of scoop. Though the experience was far from gentle, these tools were not spoken of. They were not kept on shelves or wrapped in cloth. They were chosen in silence and disposed of quickly. Children learned what to use by watching. Adults passed down preferences not through words, but through habits. In monasteries, cleaning was often done with cold water, splashed or poured with ladles. In warmer climates, smooth sticks or pottery shards were used and then rinsed. Every place had its method. None were ideal, and yet, for all its roughness, the act of cleaning was still a kind of self-respect. However crude the tools, the effort meant something. It marked the boundary between doing and being done. Between one task and the next, there were no towels, no private sinks, no gentle soaps. Only straw, cloth, leaves, and soil, passed from hand to hand, year to year, as quietly as breath. In the end, what we call hygiene was not a matter of luxury, but of what the land could offer. And the land gave just enough. So when we imagine medieval life, let us not forget the simplest acts. The quiet crouch behind a hedge, the cold hand reaching for straw, the small, stinging moment of returning to daily life, not quite clean, but clean enough. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't easy, but it was, like all things then, ordinary. Today, the act of washing one's hands is so ingrained, so automatic, that it barely registers. A twist of the tap, a drop of soap, a few seconds under warm water, and it's done. Cleanliness is effortless, invisible, expected, but in the middle, ages, water was neither abundant nor always safe. Clean hands were not a given. Washing was a ritual, not always for hygiene, but often for symbolism. In monasteries, where silence ruled and discipline framed the day, hand-washing was part of spiritual order. Before meals, monks would gather in narrow cloisters or by stone basins. Water, collected from rain or flowing through carved channels, was poured over cupped palms. The gesture was slow, respectful. A moment of pause before eating, not necessarily to remove dirt, but to prepare the soul. There was no soap, or very little of it. When it was used, it was often made in-house, a rough blend of ashen animal fat, harsh on the skin and limited in supply. Reserved for special times or specific roles, it was more sacred than sanitary. Outside the monastery walls, life was different. In villages where water came from a distant well or muddy stream, washing hands was a luxury. Buckets had to be hauled across uneven ground. Every drop counted. In many homes, a single stone or wooden basin sat near the doorway or hearth. Into it, water was poured sparingly and then reused. The entire family, one after the other, would dip their hands into the same basin, sometimes daily, often weekly. It was not a matter of cleanliness, but of rhythm. A way to mark the end of work or the beginning of rest. Children would wipe their fingers on their tunics. Farmers rinsed the dust from their palms before supper. Mothers splashed cold water over their wrists as a kind of ritual comfort. Soap, in these settings, was rare, expensive, imported, if it came at all. Often reserved for the sick, the very young, or the dead. Its scent, if it had one, was faint and earthy. A mixture of boiled roots, herbs, or animal remains. In wealthier homes, hand-washing was more deliberate. Basins were made of copper or glazed clay. Servants poured water from jugs onto their lord's hands, catching the runoff in fine bowls. Towels were offered, coarse linen or wool, sun-dried and reused. But even here, the act was more ceremonial than effective. Dirt clung beneath nails, skin cracked in winter. No one was spotless. And yet, this daily gesture, this splash and shake, held meaning. It reminded people of change, of transition. From field to table, from barn to bed, from silence to prayer. Some believed washing warded off illness. Others thought it calmed the spirit. Still others did it only because it was expected. And so, across the medieval world, hands were washed not because they were dirty, but because the motion itself was part of being human. A sign of care, of rhythm, of order in a world often unpredictable. There was no running water, no fragrant soap, no sinks carved from porcelain, only basins, buckets, bowls. The sound of water trickling over rough skin, the feel of cold on tired fingers. The simple act of rinsing away the day. And in that act, however, modest, there was a quiet kind of dignity. In the shadows of towering cathedrals and beneath the arches of bustling markets, one could often find a row of stone seats, carved not for comfort, but for necessity. These were the public latrines of the medieval city, humble, exposed, and deeply flawed. There was no privacy, no partitions, no scent of soap. Just a long shared bench with evenly spaced holes, above a dark channel where waste collected, or, in some cases, simply flowed beneath. Wooden planks groaned under the weight of use, and flies lingered like uninvited guests. People came here, not out of choice, but out of need. Market vendors, travelers, city workers, and pilgrims all lined up. Conversations slowed, eyes averted. Modesty was a luxury few could afford. In the early days, these places were seen as functional, even progressive. A place where the city attempted to organize something deeply personal. But as the years wore on and the crowds grew, so too did the problems. Cleanliness was scarce. Waste overflowed. Buckets of water, meant to flush or cleanse, were often dry. The air hung heavy, with rot, with mildew, with disease. And when the plague arrived, so did the fear. During the Black Death, public latrines took on a new identity. They were no longer just unpleasant, they became dangerous. Many believed the very air above them carried death. Others thought that plague spread from bodily humors, from contaminated stools, from proximity to the wrong person at the wrong time. Panic blossomed in the alleys behind these communal toilets. Rumors spread faster than fire. Whispers of cursed waste, of devilish illness hiding in the pits. Some said the plague could leap from one man's leavings to another's lungs. Others swore certain smells brought the fever faster. One chronicler noted a strange debate. Whose waste was more lethal? The nobles, the bakers, or the priests? A question once unthinkable had become a topic for taverns, pulpits, and even courts. In some cities, guards were posted outside latrines to limit access. In others, entire quarters banned public use. Makeshift signs were painted in chalk. Flee the seat, flee the sickness. Families warned children to hold it in. Elderly citizens chose isolation over the risk. And yet, despite the fear, the need remained. The city moved forward, hour by hour, body by body. Men still walked the stone alleys. Women still climbed the steps of the cathedral. And someone, somewhere, always needed a place to go. By nightfall, rats skittered over damp floors. Wind whistled through the hollowed brick. Buckets remained untouched. And those who passed nearby quickened their steps, held their breath, and whispered prayers, not for relief, but for safety. These latrines, in their quiet, foul existence, told a story of a city's struggle. Not just to stay clean, but to stay alive. Change in the Middle Ages did not thunder through cities like a trumpet blast. It crept in quietly, like the smell of wood smoke before dawn, or the soft shift in wind that precedes a storm. When crusaders returned from distant lands, weary, scarred, and sun-darkened, they did not only bring stories of battles and holy relics. Many of them, without knowing it, carried new habits. Small, practical ideas tucked between memory and muscle. Among them, a strange substance used by the Saracens, a thick, oily block called sabo undat to many in the East. This soap was no luxury. It was part of daily life, tied to rituals of cleanliness, prayer, and health. Crusaders, having lived through sand and siege, found themselves washing more frequently. They learned to value the cool pour of clean water, the soothing lather of scented oil. Back in Europe, these practices spread slowly. First among knights and the noble class, a basin was added to a chamber. A cloth was hung with care. Small bowls of fragrant powder appeared near bedsides. And in time, the idea of a cleanliness began to shift, from divine suggestion to social distinction. Urban centers were the first to change. In cities like Paris, Florence, or London, wealthier households began to build private spaces for washing. Rooms set aside for relief and renewal. What was once a communal necessity began to grow personal, almost sacred. And so the idea of the toilet, not merely a place, but a private experience, took root. Language reflected this shift. Words like privy, closet, and retiring room entered common speech. These were not places to discuss openly. They were whispered about. Curtain-drawn corners where one could escape the clamor of the street or the watchful eye of the servant. While the urban elite slowly embraced these changes, the countryside remained untouched. In the hills and forests, among farmers and herders, life moved with the rhythm of the earth, slow, predictable, and stubborn. Old habits endured: the familiar garden pit, the straw-covered corner, the bucket warmed by body heat. There was no shame in these things, only tradition. And yet, even here, stories traveled. A cousin visiting from the city might mention a marble bowl. A traveling monk might speak of fragrant water at a noble estate. Curiosity grew, imitation followed. A smoother piece of cloth, a second bucket. A carved seat passed down through families. Change, after all, does not shout. It whispers. And in the quiet spaces between generations, those whispers became customs. What was once a luxury became expectation. What was once strange became standard. By the late medieval period, the very idea of privacy had changed. To be clean was to be respected. To have one's own space, even a small one, was a sign of dignity. But still, far from the stone manors and candlelit halls, in the open air under star-stitched skies, many villagers still stepped outside. Each morning, bucket in hand, tradition in heart, to greet the earth as they always had. In the grand scroll of medieval history, some lines are written with blood, battles, coronations, betrayals. But between these lines, in the white space where historians rarely linger, lies a quieter tale. It is the story of routine, every day. Just before sunrise, when the sky was still the color of ash and the birds had not yet stirred, someone would step barefoot onto cold stone. A child, perhaps, carrying a clay pot with both hands, or an old woman wrapping her shawl tighter as she approached the corner of the garden. It did not matter if they lived in a castle or a cottage. The body made no distinction. The need was the same. And so, life in the Middle Ages moved to the rhythm of such needs. Before bread was baked, before prayers were whispered, before the market stalls opened, a small private journey took place. One not recorded in chronicles, but repeated 1,000 times. Across thousands of villages. To relieve oneself was not shameful. It was expected. But how and where one did it, that was shaped by class, place, and tradition. Stone seats in castles, straw-covered pits behind homes, and wooden boards over ditches in crowded towns. Each told a story not of glory, but of humanity. There was dignity, even in the mundane. A mother teaching her daughter which leaves to use. A father digging a new pit with care. A monk sweeping out the garderobe before evening silence fell. These acts, though never celebrated, built the structure of daily life. And slowly, they carved a different kind of history, a bodily, intimate, invisible history. What is remarkable is not that such routines existed, but that they endured. Through plagues and pilgrimages, through famine and feast, this quiet ritual persisted. Long after kings were forgotten and maps were redrawn, people still stepped outside in the early light, still carried their clay pots, still covered the scent with herbs, still whispered to the earth, in their own way, that they were alive. Perhaps it was this rhythm that truly anchored medieval life, not bells or banners, but the quiet return to the self, each morning and each night, a breath drawn in the cold, step on the stone floor, a rustle of leaves, the scrape of wood, the hush of water poured into soil. Nothing grand, nothing noble, but everything real. And as the centuries passed, and castles crumbled, and cities rose, these private moments were left behind, etched not into parchment, but into memory. Not remembered for their noise, but for their silence, like steam rising from a warm bucket on a winter morning. Like footprints in frost that vanish with the sun, like history itself, passing, unnoticed but always there.